Your Royal Highness, Minister, Professor Castells, guests and friends from Norway and abroad. As you will know, the Ludwig Holberg Memorial Prize is designed to award scholars who have made significant contribution to research in fields of humanities, social sciences, law and theology. And in the statute it says that through their scholarly work, prize winners shall have had a decisive influence on international research in the field in question, for example by developing new theory, knowledge or insight, by making innovative use of existing theories, or as a result of the methods used. The prize winner is then decided by the board of the Ludwig Holberg Memorial Fund, and we do it on the basis of a recommendation from the Holberg Prize Academic Committee. This academic committee consists of internationally recognized researchers from the relevant academic fields from all over the world. This year's prize winner, Manuel Castells, is Professor and Wallis Annenberg Chair in Communication Technology and Society at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He is Professor of Communication at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, Research Professor at the Open University of Catalonia in Barcelona, and Professor Emeritus at University of California, Berkeley. An overarching theme in Castells' research is analysis of power. In one of his earlier works, The Urban Question from 1972, he questioned the dominant tradition that explained the form of cities by the operation of markets across geographical space. Instead, he argued that the underlying dynamics of urban life involved local struggles for political power. Castells argued that cities created collective problems that neither traditional capitalist nor classical Marxist models could account for. In The City and the Grassroots from 1983, he deepened this analysis of the city as the product of conflict between social movements and urban power elites. In the 90s, Castells' attention shifted to the relation between globalization and emerging information technologies. His trilogy, The Information Age, Economy, Society and Culture from 1996 to 1998, deepens his continuing research into urban processes, economic transformations, technological change and civic movements. The first volume, The Rise of the Network Society, had a major impact on our understanding of global information capitalism. In The Power of Identity, he then analyzes how the network society promotes organized resistance and new social movements. The final volume, End of the Millennium, is devoted to the unevenness of the cultural transformations produced in different parts of the world in response to new technologies. Castells' latest book, Communication Power from 2009, places the concept of power at the core of his analysis of the exercise of corporate power in culture, politics and society, and the role of new media in exerting citizen power through social movements. In his recommendation to the board, the Holberg Prize Academic Committee characterizes this year's laureate as the leading sociologist of the city and new information and media technologies. His ideas and writings have shaped our understanding of the political dynamics of urban and global economies in the network society. He has illuminated the underlying power structures of the technological revolutions of our time and their consequences. He has helped us to understand how political and social movements have co-evolved with the new information technologies. Through his prescient account of the emergence of an interaction between new forms of power in the age of a network society, Castells has taken thinking about the political to an entirely new level. Today, social, cultural sciences, step by step, are being pushed further back in the queue in the competition for private and government funding. But a single-minded focus on technology and economic efficiency, without an increased understanding of the complex systems of ideas and organization which constitute the framework for human relations, is tantamount to increasing the sail management on a ship without a rudder or a compass. By his research, this year's Holberg laureate gives a brilliant proof of how important it is to stop and reverse this trend. This is knowledge and insights we need. The board of the Ludwig Holberg Memorial Prize is proud to be able to include Manuel Castells in the circle of Holberg Prize laureates. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to ask Her Royal Highness, the Crown Princess, and the Holberg Prize laureate, Manuel Castells, to join me on the podium where Professor Castells will receive this year's Holberg Prize and the Holberg Medal.
Your Royal Highness, Crown Princess Mette Marit, Minister, representatives of the Ludwig Holberg Fund, members of the Holberg Prize Academic Committee, my fellow laureate, Dr. Sarah Hobolt, my dear family and friends, respected colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to express from my heart how grateful and humbled I feel for the distinction the Holberg Memorial Fund has bestowed upon me in recognition of my scientific work. I am particularly moved and honored by being associated with the name Ludwig Holberg, a native of Bergen, who exemplified academic excellence and artistic creativity in a multidisciplinary perspective, while dedicating much of his effort to assert the culture and language of the Scandinavian societies without yielding to cultural domination of powerful states. I will always have in my mind the continuation of his intellectual and ethical legacy as my contribution to the values that the Holberg Prize represents. Indeed, as it was the case for Ludwig Holberg, my life has been dedicated to academic teaching and research since my first job as an assistant professor at the University of Paris when I was 24 years old. During my long journey across research universities around the world, I have investigated many different topics and grounded my analysis in the observation of social processes from many different countries. I started my career as an urban sociologist. I then studied social movements, economic development in Latin America and Asia, the origins and consequences of the revolution in information and communication technologies, the process of globalization that has changed economies and societies throughout the planet, the rise of the network society as the social structure of the information age, the transformation of communication by digital networks, mobile communication, and the internet, and the impact of this transformation of communication on power relationships. Yet, in spite of this thematic diversity, At the heart of my research, for over 4 decades, there has always been one overarching theme studied in the plurality of its manifestations: power. My research on cities contributed to the creation of what came to be known as the new urban sociology, whose defining feature was to shift the emphasis from urban integration in the tradition of the Chicago School to urban conflict and urban politics as the key processes in shaping urban space and the delivery of urban services. My studies in economic development in Latin America and the Asian Pacific showed the critical role of the state, both in growth and crisis, in contrast to the excessive emphasis placed on the predominant role of international market mechanism. Indeed, the success of a communist state in leading China to become the most dynamic economy in global capitalism vindicates this approach. And of course, state policies are rooted in politics, as I also showed in my studies on Chile in the 1970s and the 2000s, Mexico in the 1970s, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Finland in the 2000s. I approached the analysis of globalization by showing that the process of this late globalization was initiated by policies of states, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, and therefore globalization was shaped according to the economic interests supported by these countries, such as the deregulation of finance and the asymmetrical liberalization of trade and services. So globalization is now irreversible. However, it was not a structural necessity, but the result of a complex set of policies and politics. This is why millions of people around the world are currently not opposing globalization, but opposing this particular form of globalization and arguing that another globalization is possible. By closely studying the information and communication technology revolution in Silicon Valley from my vantage point in Berkeley, I also showed how the culture of freedom shaped the kind of technologies that emerged from this revolution, and how countries such as the Soviet Union, who could not incorporate this freedom of information and innovation, were stalled in their economic development and ultimately in their military power. This was a defining process that we documented in our fieldwork-based study of the collapse of the Soviet Union that I did with Emma Kisilyova. I also showed the interaction between technological change and social change, mediated by policies and politics, as a guiding approach to understanding the rise of the network society, the society where we live. In return, these technologies of freedom decisively contributed to the spread of social movements, challenging unjust politics and policies, the network social movements, which are my current research theme. Within all these diverse areas of inquiry, I always pursued the same analytical thread: chercher le pouvoir. This is not just a matter of personal taste, but a research strategy focused on understanding the primary source of social structuration and dynamics. Power relationships are the foundational relationships of society, because those who have the power construct institutions that organize and regulate social life according to their values and interests. I see power relationships as the DNA of society, with a specific configuration for each society derived from its history, geography, and culture. However, since societies are contradictory and conflictive, fortunately, wherever there is power, there is also counterpower, which I understand to be the capacity of social actors, of people, to challenge the power embedded in the institutions of society for the purpose of claiming representation for their own values and interests when they do not feel sufficiently represented. All institutional systems reflect power relationships as well as the limits to these power relationships as negotiated by an endless historical process of conflict and bargaining. The actual configuration of the state and of other institutions which regulate people's lives depends on this constant interaction between power and counterpower. So where power comes from? Coercion and intimidation based on the state monopoly of the capacity to exercise violence in the last resort are essential mechanisms for imposing the will of those in control of the institutions of society. However, this is not the only story. The construction of meaning in people's minds is a much more decisive and more stable source of power. The way people think determines the fate of the institutions, norms, and values on which societies are organized. This is why the fundamental power struggle in all societies is the battle for the construction of meaning in the minds of the people. So where meaning comes from? Humans create meaning by interacting with their natural and social environment, by networking their neural networks with the networks of our natural environment and with our social networks. This networking is operated by the act of communication. Communication is simply the process of sharing meaning through the exchange of information. For society at large, the key source of social production of meaning is the process of socialized communication, that is the communication that can reach, in principle, society at large. The transformation, therefore, of the communication environment directly affects the forms of meaning construction and, therefore, the production of power relationships. In recent years, the fundamental change in the realm of communication has been the rise of what I have called mass self-communication, the use of the Internet and wireless networks as platforms of digital communication. Mass self-communication provides the technological platform for the construction of the autonomy of the social actor, be it individual or collective, vis-à-vis the institutions of society. In our society, which I have conceptualized in my trilogy on the information age as a network society, power is multidimensional and is organized around networks programmed in each domain of human activity according to the interests and values of empowered actors. Networks of power exercise their power by influencing the human mind, predominantly through multimedia networks of mass communication. Thus, communication networks are decisive sources of power making. Networks of power in various domains of human activity are networked among themselves. Global financial networks and global multimedia networks are intimately linked, and this particular meta-network holds extraordinary power, but not all power, because this meta-network of finance and media is itself dependent on other major networks, such as the political network centered on the state, the cultural production network, which encompasses all kinds of cultural artifacts, the military security network, the global criminal network, and the decisive global network of production and application of science, technology, and knowledge management. The programmers of the critical networks that organize human activity are the power holders in the network society. However, networks are multiple, and therefore there is a plurality of power holders, as programmers of each network do not coincide. And so, how do power networks connect with one another while preserving their sphere of a specific action? I propose that they do so through a fundamental mechanism of power making in the network society, switching power. This is the capacity to connect two or more different networks in the process of making power for each one of them in their respective fields. If power is exercised by programming and switching networks, then counterpower, the deliberate attempt to change power relationships, is enacted also by reprogramming networks around alternative interests and values and disrupting the dominant switches while switching networks of resistance and social change locally and globally. Actors of social change are able to exert decisive influence by using mechanisms of power making that correspond to the forms and processes of power in the specific conditions of the network society. Indeed, social movements throughout history are the producers of new values and goals around which the institutions of society are transformed to represent these values by creating new norms to organize social life. Social movements exercise counterpower by first constructing themselves through a process of autonomous communication, free of the control of institutional power. Because mass media are today largely controlled by governments and media corporations, in the network society, communicative autonomy is primarily constructed in the internet networks and in the platforms of wireless communication. Digital social networks offer the possibility, just the possibility, for largely unfettered deliberation and coordination of action. However, this is only one component of the communicative processes through which social movements relate to society at large. They also need to build public space by creating communities in the urban space. Since the institutional public space, the constitutionally designated space for deliberation, is occupied by the interests of the dominant elites and their networks, social movements need to carve out a new public space that is not limited to the internet, but makes itself visible in the places of social life and in the cultural institutions. Then a new public space is created, a hybrid of cyberspace and urban space. I call this third space the space of autonomy. From this space of autonomy, new projects are created to transform social life and enhance our capacity to live together and in peace with our natural environment, when the old institutions of society appear to be exhausted in their legitimacy and in their efficiency in managing our lives. We are currently at one of these historical crossroads. The financial crisis that has shaken global capitalism is not simply an economic crisis. It is a crisis of the values underlying the flows of capital, creating virtual wealth out of speculative maneuvers enacted with the help of powerful computer networks and mathematical models. It is a crisis that results from the disregard of human well-being, of inner peace, and of natural conservation. It is a crisis that derives from the fact that this disregard is based on the assumption of the bailout of these cynical lords of the space of financial flows by the powers of the state, using the real wealth produced by their subjects. Furthermore, the financial crisis is coupled with a crisis of crisis management, as the crisis of political legitimacy spreads around the world. The data show that in most countries of the world, with the major exception of Scandinavia, the majority of citizens do not trust their governments, their parliaments, and their political parties. They, in fact, despise what has come to be known as the political class. The combination of an intractable financial crisis with a deep crisis of political legitimacy opens a period of uncertainty in the lives of people at large, particularly in Europe and the United States. In such periods, the old plagues of fundamentalist nationalism, bigotry, racism, xenophobia, and intolerance are played by demagogues to conquer the state over the ruins of a fatigued democracy. But these are also periods in which new social movements rise to assert human values and to reconstruct democracy, real democracy, from the bottom up, grassroots participatory institutions. This is the practice of the network social movements that has sprung around the world in the last 2 years and that I have investigated and analyzed in my last book, Networks of Outrage and Hope, to be published in September. What I have observed gives indeed reasons to hope for a better world in the aftermath of the crisis, because millions of people are actively and peacefully engaged in finding new ways of sharing, living together, and searching for a meaningful life. The fundamental issue still unsolved is the reaction of the current political institutions vis-à-vis these waves of goodwill that do not recognize themselves in the bureaucratized and sometimes corrupted channels of our aging democratic institutions. If our current leaders give priority to the defense of their obsolete political system, tailored for their own interests, we will descend in a maelstrom of social disintegration. Instead, if they accept the challenge and they decide to learn new politics by joining in good faith the effort of finding alternative economic policies and new ways of participatory democracy, then we may be at the threshold of a true humanistic revolution, supported by our extraordinary technological capacity that we have not truly tapped into until now because of our lack of audacity in reinventing society. These are times of trouble, and it is in these times when rigorous social science committed to the betterment of humankind must rise to the occasion and deliver its promise of understanding our world to help those daring to imagine a better one and who are willing to fight for it. Thank you very much.